I sipped my coffee and stared at the half-finished page in the mouth of my old Underwood. 3 days. 3 days, and this was what I had to show for it. I put my head in my hands and leaned back in the squeaky old office chair that had been here when I arrived. I couldn't get my mind on my work today, and that was a big problem. I'd rented the cabin for 2 weeks, 2 weeks of bliss away from screaming children and honey-do lists, and now I was 3 days deep with nothing to show for it but 3 paragraphs and writer's block. Smooth jazz caressed me from the speakers of my little CD player, but today its chords might have well been breaking glass. The wind blew outside, kicking up leaves against that glass, and as the jazz played on, I heard it again. There was something else under the surface of that jangling wind, the rattling sound that had been breaking my concentration for the last 3 days. A maddening, almost skeletal sound that wouldn't stop. I turned back to my work, but within minutes, I had stopped again. The story was supposed to be about... What the hell was the story supposed to be about again? A horror writer in the woods, or something cliche like that. It had all seemed so well put together when I'd driven up here 3 days ago. A writer in the woods, writing his story, while something supernatural lurks around him, making his stories come to life. I tapped absent-mindedly at the keys for a few more minutes before I growled and yanked the paper out of the Underwood, throwing it in the garbage can. The Underwood was a vanity, and I knew it. I own 3 computers, one of them a very nice and very expensive MacBook. But I used the Underwood because it made me feel like a professional. Someone had told me at a convention or a book signing or something that real writers use typewriters. So I went out and paid an excessive amount of money for this ancient engine of destruction. Took a lot of money to keep this golem up and running, too, but I paid it, toting this heavy thing around in a case that was half as expensive as it had been, and felt that my writing was better for it. It would not have shocked me to learn that many writers had similar totems. The wind scuttled through the trees again, and this time I jumped when the leaves spattered against the window. It sounded like someone throwing a fistful of rocks against the glass, but that wasn't what had surprised me. I had been listening for that clattering sound, the almost musical knocking that sounded so familiar, and the sound of the skeletal leaves had caught me off guard. I cursed as I pulled the half-started sheet and threw it away. I had laid across the keyboard in my panic, and now it was ruined. I drew another sheet down into the guts of the old contraption and began to write again, getting a little further this time as I sipped my coffee, becoming quite happy with the results. The mountain path ran up and up and up as he scaled the climb and made his way to the cabin near the top. The snow lay like delicate lace upon the ground, and the tires of his Dodge Charger crunched into the snow as I stopped. A Charger? The writer hadn't had a Charger in the other writings I'd done. The Charger was mine, a big black brute that now hunkered outside the cabin as I wasted time inside. What was the writer driving again? He couldn't have gotten a Charger up here in the snow anyway. The car was great for highways and gravel roads, but snow and hills would have left it parked and waiting for more favorable conditions. I considered leaving it, but it just wouldn't do. I dragged out the correction tape and changed it to Jeep instead. Still, I wish the writer could experience the bliss of owning something I had wanted since I was a kid. The car out front had been a present, a reward for good service, which hadn't stopped my wife from complaining about it. "Really? A muscle car? That's so like you, Derek. Leave it to you to publish a book and have a midlife crisis all in the same week." She didn't get it, though. This had been a reward. When my first novel had sold 500,000 copies, I'd paid cash for it on the lot and felt like somewhere in my past, a 12-year-old version of myself was grinning and pumping his fist. My old man had wanted a charger, had talked longingly about getting one anytime he saw one, but he had been a welder for a rinky-dink construction outfit and had disdained books almost as much as he disdained his poof of a son for writing them. Well, now Dad was in the ground, and look who was screaming down the road in a charger. I changed my mind again. The car stayed, and changed it again before moving on. Pulled his bags from the car and walked to the cabin. 2 weeks of peace and quiet to finish his book. 2 weeks of just him and his old typewriter in the picturesque cabin. Going up had been an adventure, but going down again would be suicide, and he only meant to tempt fate once. For better or worse, he was up here for 2 weeks. He had enough food, smokes, whiskey, and toilet paper for 14 days, and if it ran out, then he supposed he would just have to do without. His editor said his new book had to be ready before October, or he might as well shelve it forever, and he meant to have it ready. I nodded as I took the sheet off the typewriter, liking where this was going. The writer was at the cabin now. That was a start. Now I just had to get the rest of it. I wished my editor had told me I only had 2 weeks to write my latest mediocre piece of trash. My editor was a nice guy, but he was definitely more than a little spineless. He was more than willing to wheedle and kiss ass when what I really needed was a good boot in the backside. A deadline or an ultimatum might have motivated me more than what I actually had going on. It hadn't been a deadline, but due dates that pushed me to get to work on the book. The car was paid off, but the house was still a work in progress. Money from my first book was also beginning to run dry. The cabin had been an expense that I didn't really have, but if it birthed another book, then I suppose it was worth it. The wind hit the side of the house again, and I heard those unsettling wind chimes bang together for the 1,000th time. I couldn't figure out where they were. I hadn't seen any wind chimes when I came in, or I would have taken them down after the first night. At first they'd been a little interesting, but as time passed, they became downright grating. They were different from any wind chimes I'd ever heard. It didn't sound like metal, but it didn't sound like wood either. It sounded hollow, kind of like the leaves that kept rattling against the glass. The first night they had woken me up more than once. When I did sleep, it had come into my dreams, and the dreams would have made a good book all their own. Someone knocked, and I jerked a little as I went to see who it was. I was honestly a little glad for the distraction, ready to chalk this whole thing up as a wash the longer it went on. Seemed like I was honestly just looking for a reason to take a break, and I worried I wouldn't have anything to prop up the cost of this trip. My wife was going to have a fit, very likely, but I think the bigger disappointment would be that I didn't have a book for her to proofread. Melina had loved Feist, my first book, and it had held us together through some of the rougher times. She, not my editor, had pushed me to finish it, and I'd seen her read the battered old hard copy I'd gotten for her for Christmas a lot during our marriage. That was why I had to finish this one so desperately. I needed to remind her that I could still be the man that she had fallen in love with. The man on the other side of the door seemed relieved when he saw me, and I opened it with what I hoped was a friendly greeting. James had been hesitant to rent me the cabin, despite the good weather we'd been having, and it had taken a little coaxing to get the story out of him. We'd been corresponding for a month before he let me make a reservation, and the first night here, after a couple of handles of good whiskey, he had told me the reason. It appeared I wasn't the only one who had rented the place to get some work done, and the last guy had left him holding the bag in more ways than one. I came to check on him pretty regular, but one day, he just wasn't here. His truck was here, his stuff was here, but he was just gone. They never found him, but I keep looking for him when I go on my hikes sometimes. He didn't seem to like the sound of the weird wind chimes either, and he couldn't tell me what the sound was. "Hey," he said, his smile only slightly worried. "Just coming to make sure you didn't need anything. I brought some wood, too. They say there might be a blow-up tonight, and I didn't want you to freeze up here." I looked outside, craning my neck as if I expected to see the words "snow" written in the sky by some huge hand. "In September?" I asked, thinking he must be joking. He shrugged. "It happens some years. The weather here is temperamental, so do you need anything?" I shook my head. "I think I'm all set. I've got enough supplies for a month at least." That had been by design. Once I came up here, I didn't want to do anything but write and sleep and exist. Clearly I was making a botch of one of those things, but this guy didn't need to know about that. He nodded. "Well, if you need anything, let me know. I've got an old snowmobile if you get stuck up here, but I don't think it'll be that bad. Your car looks heavy enough to make it down, even if it snowed a foot of powder." I nodded, resisting the urge to tell him it was a Charger, and we parted ways. I gave it another half hour in front of the Underwood before shaking my head and going to get the whiskey I'd brought with me. Sometimes great writing needed a little lubricant. All the great writers knew that. That was why most of them had been drunks. A couple of handles in and I was ready to write. I got back to work as the sun set behind the smeary windows. As I walked the writer through the setting up, I must have hit a hard head of steam because I started really banging it out as afternoon stretched into evening. I had a couple more glasses of whiskey, and as the paper got harder and harder to see, I found the pages were stacking up. The rattling kept right on coming, but I was too drunk to care. The juices were flowing, and when I slipped sideways halfway into my 6th or 7th glass, I saw something hitting the window as I passed out. They were small, the white flakes looking very wet as they slapped against the glass, and I slid sideways. They were small, the white flakes looking very wet as they slapped against the glass and slid sideways. I hadn't really had a lot of experience with snow, but I remembered something like this from when I was a kid. The snow hadn't stuck, but I had laid in bed watching it hit the window as my nightlight had thrown soft light across the glass. I lay there in a stupor and remembered that, and when the wind chimes came again, hollow and ethereal, I remembered something else. I remembered watching something on TV, a 5-tet of dancing skeletons as they wiggled and wobbled in the autumn air. Somehow I imagined that the sound I heard would be like that. The sound of hollow bones banging against each other would make a sound like that. But the more I tried to fix on it, the foggier the dreams became. Finally, as my drunken dreams usually did, I was suddenly awake, and I'd traveled through time to a new place and a new when. I was shivering on the floor of the cabin, the inside suddenly very chilly, and the snow against the windows making the insides shadowy. It was sometime in the mid-morning, after dawn but before lunch, and the drift was up to the lip of the windowsill. I guess it had been more than a few inches, and as I staggered to my feet, I looked out and saw that my Charger was covered in snow up to the door handles. Jesus, it had just dumped 3 feet overnight. Luckily, I had wood and bottled water, so I got myself a drink to cut the sharp edge of my hangover, and got the fire going in the fireplace. As the snow rattled against the window and the hollow chimes continued to clang together, I sat down to look over what I had written. For drunken ramblings, it was pretty good. They were almost on topic, too, all of them laying out the strange sound that kept assaulting the writer as he worked. Wasn't the direction I'd intended to go, but I liked what my drunken self had put together so far. He sat at the keys, fingers ready for battle, but as they went to work, he heard the sound of it as it scraped across his nerves. It was a hollow clunking, the sound of old plastic bottles falling downstairs. And as the wind outside pushed at the house incessantly, the sound continued. It was a mystery at first, something he chased, but soon it would become maddening. That was pretty good, I reflected. The writer went looking for the sound, but couldn't seem to find anything. There were no chimes on the porch, front or back, and there were none hanging from the eaves. He checked the ragged trees around the house and even looked under the porch, but he couldn't find anything. There were no wind chimes anywhere, and that was when he noticed the window. Window? I said, flipping the page. What window? This story had taken a turn I hadn't planned on, but now he was talking about windows. The cabin he was in was supposed to be a single story, no upstairs to have a window. Of course, I hadn't meant to give the guy a charger either, and now he had one. The story was taking on a mystery feel, and I found that I liked it. I sat back down to write, feeding more paper in, but as I clicked away at the keys, I found that the threads just wouldn't come. It wasn't the story I had in mind, and now it was going off into uncharted waters. I tore a few pages out and tossed them, grunting as the light cut into my vision, and by noon, I was looking at the half-empty bottle again. Maybe a little of the old inspiration could be found in its depths. 3 shots later, and I was off again. The window was important. There was someone in the window. He could see them, but he didn't know how to get there. There were no stairs, no way for anyone to get up there, so how were they there? I took another shot and kept writing. Suddenly, the cabin I was in and the cabin I was writing about were one and the same. There was a stranger in the cabin, someone lurking in the walls, and the writer felt like if he didn't find them, then they would surely drive him crazy. They were the ones making the noise. They were responsible for the hollow chimes, and if he wanted to keep his sanity, then the writer needed to find them. I passed out again that night, waking up in the morning with an even nastier hangover and about 20 pages of new material. I could get used to this whole getting drunk and waking up with pages deal. The writer had continued his own book, a book within a book, but his mind kept wandering to that person in the upper story. He had called the realtor he had rented the place from, but the man had assured him that the window was aesthetic. There was nothing up there. The writer didn't believe him, and reflected on a story the man had told him about another writer who had gone missing in the house, a writer who had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. He'd been working on his novel, a long mystery that he seemed to be making progress on, when he suddenly vanished. His truck was there, his things were there, but he was gone. I searched for him, but there was no sign. He kept a journal, and the journal talked a lot about strange sounds that he had heard when the wind blew. It was the rattling, hollow clatter of chimes, and the writer became quite mad. The realtor said this, and he had found holes in the walls where the man had gone searching for them, and he had charged the man's estate for the damages in his absence. I hoped the guy who had rented me the cabin wouldn't mind that I borrowed his story, but it was really coming along now. I had some idea where it was going, and one look outside told me I wasn't going anywhere. The snow was up to the porch now, and I had to force the door open to go check on a theory. As the house in the story became the house I was staying in, at least in my mind, I wanted to see if there was a window out there. Maybe I was working elements of real life into my tale, and as I tromped through the snow, I was a little relieved to see that there was no window over the porch. The roof rose into a upside-down V, and though there might be an attic up there somewhere, it wasn't big enough for a room. I started to go back inside, but something told me to walk around a little bit. I'd made a full circuit of the house and was heading back to the front porch when my foot came down on something and sent me sprawling. It had been small and slippery, the object rolling out treacherously as I turned, and as I lay there in the snow, I looked up and found the window. It was round, not a bay window like I had talked about in the story, and as I squinted, I thought I could see something up there. It was subtle, a dark outline, but it was definitely person-shaped. I reached down into the snow to see if I could find what I had slipped on, and came up with a cracked but still intact shot glass. The idea that I had come out here before the snow was very deep seemed to make sense. I'd come out here while I was drunk and looked at this window, and that was why it had stuck so fast in my mind. I'd seen it, seen the person-shaped shadow, and my mind had started running. It had been like that with Feist, too. I had seen something, a little dog hunting ground squirrels one afternoon, and my mind had raced along like one of those little squirrels. I spent the next 3 days writing, drinking, and nursing my pounding head in the morning. By the end of the first week, I had my story, but not my ending. The snow didn't melt, but it didn't grow any faster after that night. It froze into a tightly packed little hillock, and my expedition outside was very chilly. I could have driven through them if I had needed to get out, but going down the mountain with 3 feet of snow on the ground would have been close to suicide. The radio had said the snow would melt before it was time to leave, so I took it as a sign to just keep writing. The writer, my writer, had found the journal of the writer that had gone missing. It was hidden behind some books in the reading nook, and he had immersed himself in the man's ramblings. The writer was being slowly driven crazy by the sound of the wind chimes, but he believed that they were talking to him as well. They wanted to be found. They wanted to tell him a great secret, and as he searched for the secrets of the cabin, so did I. I started looking for a way into the attic. It had to be somewhere, but the house was devoid of any of the usual loft entrances I was used to seeing. There were no ceiling entrances, no pull-down ladders, and as my time began to wane, I thought of something I hadn't. Taking a leaf from the Scooby-Doo notebook, I started looking for secret entrances. The book had ground to a halt, the writer stuck trying to find his own way into the secret room, but I figured once I discovered the source of the wind chimes, I would have my ending too. I was starting to consider making some holes in the wall myself when I noticed something I should have right away. By the reading nook, there was a portion of the ceiling that was curved. It curved up, the rest of the ceiling being mostly flat, but it was enough to notice that this would be the most obvious place for a stairwell. I started moving the bookcase, sliding them to the side as I looked for the source, and was rewarded with a doorway. It was so seamless that I could believe that no one had found it. Maybe even the guy who had rented it before me had known about it, though that seemed like a stretch. The doorway squalled on rusty hinges as it came open, and I took the stairs slowly and deliberately. If someone was up there, then they would have surely heard me. But I suppose they already knew I was down there. As I came to the top, I froze as the person shape came into view. They were standing about a foot from the window, just staring in the direction of the muted light. And the longer I looked, the more I realized they weren't standing. The person would have had a hard time standing, especially in their condition. They moved ever so slightly as the wind came in through the eaves, and as it did, I heard the hollow sound of the chimes. They swayed to and fro, their bones held together with the thinnest of tendons, and some of the bones on the ground showed that they had been falling apart as time went by. I closed the hatch and called the man who had rented the cabin to me. I had to let him know that I had found the writer. Turned out I would be leaving on time, but I'd have to finish the book at home. The police had a lot of questions, as did the guy I rented the cabin from. For starters, he was unaware that the place had an attic. He had inherited it from his uncle and had done little but rent it out for the last 5 years. When the guy had disappeared in it last year, he had just assumed he had wandered off in the woods, but it appeared that the writer had discovered the secret passage and how to close it behind himself. They had found the writer's screenplay in the attic, along with his body, the body that I had been hearing all this time. He was little more than forearms, leg bones, and rib cage now, but his body had deteriorated until his bones were being held together by the thinnest of cartilage and skin. No one knew why he had decided to hang himself up there. He hadn't left a journal like the missing writer in my story, but he had a history of antidepressants and mental health issues. The owner of the cabin said he was glad to have finally found him, but I think I'll end my book a little differently. Even as I drive down the mountain, I can see the ending of the book coming together. The writer discovers a secret room where the realtor hides the bodies of the writers whose stories he steals, and the writer manages to fight him off before he becomes his last victim. Should be a good ending and a great story for the book circuit after I publish it. It isn't every day that you get to be part of a real-life mystery, after all.